A phrase has surfaced in corporate marketing: experience the joy of certainty. It is the new tagline of California Psychics, a company that profits by selling the feeling of knowing the future. But this phrase is more than a marketing gimmick. It is a condensed ideology, an emblem of a larger trend: the commodification of conviction, the elimination of justification, the restructuring of knowledge as a consumable product. What began as a business model is now an epistemic transformation, one that is already reshaping how institutions, industries, and individuals experience truth itself. This module presents an emerging cognitive vulnerability, one that threatens the integrity of public perception, decision-making, and ultimately, societal stability. Intelligence suggests that certainty, the foundation of rational judgment, has been severed from truth. No longer earned through verification and evidence, certainty is now a product, designed, packaged, and sold to those willing to pay for conviction. A shift is taking place in which truth is no longer a prerequisite for belief. It has become an optional component in a marketplace where perception is dictated by those with the power to manufacture it. This transformation carries profound national security implications. A population conditioned to consume certainty as an experience, rather than pursue it as an intellectual process, becomes highly susceptible to misinformation, manipulation, and systemic destabilization. When belief is no longer an individual pursuit, but a pre-manufactured product, the capacity for independent critical reasoning is eroded. And in such an environment, those who control perception control everything. Certainty was once a structured process built upon three pillars: truth, justification, and conviction. Truth ensured correspondence with reality. Justification required evidence, reason, and verification. Conviction was the psychological state that emerged from these first two conditions. This system formed the foundation of science, law, governance, philosophy, and journalism, ensuring that belief had a measurable connection to objective reality. But in the emerging paradigm, certainty is no longer a conclusion, it is a service. Instead of being built through a process of validation, it is delivered on demand, detached from the need for justification. In the past, conviction arose because of truth and evidence. Now, it is being sold directly, no justification required. This shift is not trivial. It is a fundamental restructuring of how people understand reality. It prioritizes emotional certainty over intellectual certainty, training individuals to trust what feels right rather than what can be demonstrated. It fosters dependence on external sources to generate confidence, as people lose the ability to develop certainty through critical analysis. And most dangerously, it forces institutions that rely on verification, science, journalism, law, to compete against industries that offer faster, easier, and more emotionally gratifying certainty. This restructuring creates widespread vulnerabilities. A society conditioned to accept certainty without justification becomes easy to manipulate. Those with the most influence over public perception, corporate marketing firms, political propaganda machines, mass media conglomerates, gain the ability to dictate reality, not by proving what is true, but by controlling what people believe to be true. The ability to sell certainty without requiring truth is more than just a profitable business model. It is a tool of influence and control, with ripple effects across every major sector of society. This epistemic shift does not simply mislead individuals. It restructures governance, economics, law, education, and security. The industries most dependent on verification and intellectual rigor are now losing ground to industries that simply manufacture confidence. The collapse of truth as a prerequisite for certainty has fundamentally altered the media landscape. News is now optimized for engagement rather than accuracy, creating echo chambers where people consume only what aligns with their emotional biases. The competition is no longer between true and false reporting, but between narratives that generate the strongest conviction. The commodification of belief removes accountability from political leadership. When public certainty is engineered through repetition and emotional appeal, Governance is dictated by conviction-based narratives rather than evidence-based reasoning. Politicians and policymakers can now manufacture public confidence independent of policy effectiveness or factual correctness. Medical misinformation thrives in an environment where certainty can be mass-produced. Pseudoscience flourishes not because it is correct, but because it is emotionally satisfying. As a result, public trust in scientific expertise is eroded, and healthcare decisions become dictated by belief rather than data. The justice system depends on justification and proof, but in a society where conviction no longer requires evidence, the legitimacy of due process is called into question. As legal verdicts become increasingly subjected to public emotional pressure, the principles of rational deliberation and factual adjudication weaken, replaced by perception-driven justice. Schools and universities face growing resistance from ideological movements that frame skepticism as a threat and blind conviction as a virtue. The shift toward prepackaged certainty discourages independent inquiry, turning education into a marketplace of competing narratives rather than a structured process for knowledge acquisition. These changes fundamentally weaken society's ability to self-correct. The mechanisms that once ensured truth could be discovered, challenged, and refined are now being replaced by systems that reward confidence over accuracy. The result is an environment where perception is more powerful than reality, and those who control perception dictate the course of history. The severing of certainty from truth creates deep structural vulnerabilities. These risks do not remain confined to one sector. They permeate governance, security, economics, and cultural stability. Let's review the most pressing concerns. The rise of commercialized truth markets. When belief becomes a competitive industry, those with the most financial resources will dominate public trust. Truth itself becomes privatized. The decline of institutional legitimacy. Institutions built on verification, skepticism, and justification, such as science, journalism, and legal systems, lose credibility in the face of more emotionally compelling narratives. The weaponization of manufactured conviction. If conviction can be engineered, then power no longer belongs to those accountable to reality, but to those who most effectively manipulate belief. In this world, truth becomes a tool of the highest bidder. These risks are not hypothetical. The 2016 misinformation crisis, in which emotionally charged falsehoods spread faster than verifiable facts, was an early warning. The mechanisms of engineered certainty are already being deployed at scale. The public has already been trained to consume certainty as a product. This scenario presents a shifting landscape of influence and control in which teams must assess the mechanisms driving the commodification of certainty and their broader implications. The process of response, interpret, plan, execute, relies on recognizing the triadic relationships shaping public perception and institutional stability. At each stage, these relationships define where vulnerabilities emerge, how forces interact, and what structural dynamics influence the trajectory of belief and decision-making. Understanding the forces that shape the manufacturing of certainty requires recognizing the systemic relationships that dictate how truth, conviction, and power interact. Certainty, justification, and conviction. Traditionally, conviction follows from justification, which in turn follows from truth. In a world where certainty is commodified, this process is inverted. Conviction is now produced directly, independent of justification, while truth is left optional. The greater the emotional reinforcement of conviction, the less justification is required, and the less justification is required, the weaker the public's capacity for critical reasoning becomes. The result is a system where certainty is no longer earned. It is felt, packaged, and delivered. Commerce, media, and governance. In this new landscape, commerce, media, and governance form a reinforcing cycle. Corporate interests benefit from an uninquisitive public, media thrives on engagement over accuracy, and governance leverages mass conviction for stability or control. Media entities structure narratives to maximize conviction rather than truth, which in turn influences governance by shaping voter certainty. In response, governments either capitulate to conviction-based policymaking or exploit it to consolidate authority. Meanwhile, commercial entities profit from this feedback loop, refining ever more effective ways to package and sell belief itself. Public trust, institutional legitimacy, and narrative control. Public trust is the currency of control. When institutional legitimacy erodes, trust does not disappear. It shifts toward those who best manage narrative control. Institutions that rely on evidence and verification struggle to compete against actors who provide immediate emotional certainty. The more people turn toward pre-packaged conviction, the less influence traditional institutions hold, and the easier it becomes for new power structures to redefine reality. In this environment, belief is dictated not by who is right, but by who best controls the mechanisms of perception. Once NSLARP teams understand the mechanisms driving engineered certainty, they must assess how different forces interact to reinforce, resist, or exploit the new paradigm. Disruption, adaptation, and exploitation. Any response to manufactured certainty must account for the self-reinforcing nature of conviction. Disrupting this cycle requires either undermining conviction itself or restoring the demand for justification. Adaptation involves recognizing that rational certainty no longer governs decision-making and developing ways to operate within this reality. Exploitation means accepting that perception is the battleground, using the same mechanisms of influence to shape conviction in deliberate and strategic ways. Doubt, inquiry, and institutional resilience. Doubt was once a mechanism of intellectual rigor, leading to inquiry and deeper understanding. Now, doubt is framed as a weakness, something to be avoided rather than explored. Inquiry struggles against a landscape designed to suppress skepticism, where instant certainty is more appealing than slow, methodical verification. Institutional resilience depends on whether systems of knowledge can survive in an environment where inquiry is discouraged and conviction is mass-produced. Consensus, division, and influence. In a world where truth is secondary to narrative, social cohesion is increasingly dictated by shared conviction rather than shared reality. Conviction-based consensus strengthens group identity, but also intensifies division against those outside the accepted belief structure. The greater the emotional reinforcement of a belief, the harder it becomes to introduce doubt or counter evidence. As society polarizes around conviction-driven narratives, the ability to influence mass perception becomes the primary tool of power. In this stage, teams must assess whether disruption is possible, whether adaptation is necessary, and where points of leverage exist within the cycle of belief formation. The final stage is action, engaging with a system where certainty is engineered and resistance to skepticism is built in. Control, resistance, and submission. In an environment where perception dictates reality, those who control belief structures hold power. Resistance requires challenging the mechanisms that reinforce conviction, whether through direct confrontation or by reintroducing justification into the cycle. Submission is not necessarily passive. It may be a strategic decision to operate within the constraints of the system, using its structure to redirect conviction rather than oppose it outright. Media leverage, social networks, and perception management. Mass certainty is not formed in isolation. It spreads through networks of reinforcement, media amplification, and social validation. Those who control digital platforms, information ecosystems, and interpersonal belief networks dictate which narratives gain traction. Whether countering dominant narratives or reinforcing new ones, engagement with these systems is essential for shaping conviction at scale. Ethics, strategy, and survival. Any action taken within this system carries ethical considerations. To engage with the mechanisms of belief formation is to participate in the very processes that created the problem. Strategy must balance the risk of reinforcing the system against the necessity of operating within it. Survival in a world where truth is secondary to conviction requires recognizing that certainty has already been weaponized. Whether one chooses to wield it or resist it, it cannot be ignored. Teams must determine whether to challenge, manipulate, or navigate this structure in ways that align with their strategic objectives. This scenario presents an intelligence challenge, not a predefined solution. The relationships outlined here define how conviction is engineered, where vulnerabilities emerge, and what structural dynamics shape belief formation. Each action taken within this landscape reinforces, disrupts, or adapts to the new paradigm. Teams must determine their priorities, their tolerances, and their objectives. The question is no longer whether certainty is for sale. The question is, what will you do with that knowledge?